I remember the words I used to describe Rising of the Shield Hero at the finish in its first episode. I called it a cheap enjoyment. I remember since I'd watched the episode on the night it had aired, which I usually make a point not to do because, I'd rather avoid the weekly blue balls. The reason I decided to watch Shield Hero that night wasn't because I was a fan of the source material or anything. It was because I noticed that the first episode had an extended runtime, and I just so happened to have that much time and nothing else to do. By full admission, I wanted to hate it. It just seemed like another isekai for me to shamelessly insert myself into that were a dime a dozen at the time. But after finishing the first episode, I reluctantly but quickly added the series to my watch list, and joined a Discord call with a friend. He had wanted my take on the series, it being the newest, hottest thing at the time. I responded I had planned to continue watching, but was again quick to warn that it was a cheap enjoyment. Speaking of its extended runtime, it was quite a unique thing to do, but I think it proved to be a wise strategy, considering it managed to get an initial boost of, and was able to maintain hype till its conclusion, while not being completely washed away by other vastly more popular IPs that were also being released that season, and get greenlit for not just one, but 2 new seasons. It may have only been able to accomplish this by making sure that the viewer's first experience with the story ended with the show's narrative hook, as to invest the viewer in the hero's plight before they even had a chance to drop it. Goblin Slayer did essentially the same thing just a season prior, and Vinland Saga would do the same thing 2 seasons later by releasing its first 3 episodes at the same time, and in the 3rd episode with Thor's initial confrontation with the Askeladd pirates. Oh, he's dead for sure. Vinland Saga and Shield Hero are not doing anything new when it comes to using an early plot point to hook the viewer into watching more. In the history of entertainment, I doubt that this tactic has not been used in the vast majority of art, both visual, written, and even musical. Especially in today's saturated hellscape where there's so much vying for your limited attention and time, it's crucial for all media that wants to garner any sort of an audience that it can convince its audience to stick with it within the shortest amount of time possible, by any means possible. That's why a lot of entertainment starts right in the middle of the action, even if that action is completely incomprehensible and will continue to be for a good while. In fact, when it comes to anime, a lot of the tropes that have become synonymous with the medium are due to this same reason. And as an economic tool, that's truly all there is to it. Where it begins to get more complicated is how this practice exists as a narrative tool. You may have hooked your catch, but reeling them in is a whole other task entirely. But, before that, let's talk monkeys. Capuchin monkeys to be exact. They were the subject of a now famous and widely cited experiment. Monkeys reject unequal pay. In this experiment, 2 capuchin monkeys were put into cages right next to each other, with a clear design priority of the monkeys being visible to one another. In the experiment, the monkeys were given simple tasks to complete and rewards for completing those tasks. One of the monkeys was given the reward of a cucumber, and would happily complete his task and enjoy his cucumber until he saw that the monkey in the adjacent cell was getting the more delicious grape for the same task. After that, the monkey would no longer be satisfied by the cucumber, and when it was continued to be paid unfairly, the monkey would become enraged, stop following orders, and even throw the cucumber back at the experimenter. The reason this experiment is so interesting is because it supports the hypothesis that a sense of fairness is much more a biological response than it is a strictly rational one, a product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, dispelling the earlier idea that only humans could have a sense of fairness because of our much higher sense of reason. Experiments of this kind have been replicated across many other species with varied results. But it's become undeniable that there's much more going on in the minds of animals than we first suspected. Something a little while ago we would have considered distinctly human. For instance, did you know tigers are incredibly vengeful creatures? One famous story states that a poacher by the name of Vladimir Markov shot, wounded, and stole prey from a tiger. That same tiger would go on to systematically find and destroy anything with the hunter's scent on it, follow his scent all the way back to his cabin, wait at his front door for him to come home, then mauled and killed him. Considering how premeditated the tiger's actions were, and the fact that humans aren't really a tiger's first choice for food, the tiger didn't attack Markov for sustenance, or even to protect his territory. He was paying Markov back for the bullet wound, with interest. The uncomfortable truth is our feelings about morality can be much more primitive and ingrained than they are justified. And it's that sentiment that has breeded success for storytellers for centuries. Stories about unfair situations or even revenge are successful because they have a strong, visceral effect on us. It appeals to our very biology in a simple and straightforward way. But it's important to make a distinction. A work of fiction's ability to have an effect on you isn't always a sign of its quality or complexity. In other words, just because a show can pique your interest, or even hold it, doesn't mean it's that great or worthy of praise. I think the perfect way to illustrate this is with ass and titties. Sex sells, but that doesn't mean it's worth buying. Using sex appeal to garner an audience is pretty ubiquitously considered a cheap tactic. This is because it can often feel like cheating. You can go through all the effort of writing a story with intrigue and mystery, with a vibrant setting and world, or you can just slap some tits and ass on the front to get more or less the same, if not better exposure. Why try to appeal to someone's higher faculties when you could just plug yourself straight into their frontal lobe by appealing to an instinct to indiscriminately spread genetic information? And for what it's worth, it isn't like there isn't a place for that kind of thing. Who doesn't want their frontal lobe to be probed from time to time? But you won't find me trying to justify my degeneracy as good taste. This is because I can recognize the difference between a work of art or entertainment that appeals to me in a much more deep, personal, and complex way, versus a work that appeals to my most basic and surface-level instincts. Just because something grabs your attention, it may have succeeded in its practical objective, but still fail, in the same way that porn may be stimulating, but I doubt anyone would call big round Latina sluts 4 high art. The best storytellers are those with a keen understanding of human nature. A storyteller has to take advantage of the human psyche to hook a viewer in the same way that a fisherman has to change their bait and lure in accordance to what fish they're trying to catch. And as cringy as it is, when anime flashes panties or has our protagonist accidentally cop a feel, or introduce an unjustifiably evil character, it's an application of that century-old art. But it's a cheap one, because we can tell it's simple and uninteresting, even if it's effective. This is what I meant when I called Shield Hero a cheap enjoyment. Despite being invested and prepared to continue, I wasn't in the slightest reassured as to whether it was going to be worth my time. I didn't care for the characters, the setting, or the overall story. To be real, all I wanted to see was that fucking bitch mine get her shit punched in. I wanted to see an unfair situation made fair. There was a part of me that didn't want to continue. But the part of me that did was just that much louder. So it's really how a series follows up on its hook that would decide how I should judge it. And it's more than 2 years later. And you know what? This shit sucked. In fact, in a pretty funny way too. Because Shield Hero started off strong and got this initial dap up from the community, I feel like when it began to deteriorate, a lot of people just didn't notice. Or what I'd like to believe, they did, but they already posted all those Raftilia memes or defended it on Reddit. And now they are in too deep. You said you liked Rising of the Shield Hero, and it was too late to back out now. Shield Hero had two big selling points at its start. First, it seemed to deviate from the standard isekai formula that people were starting to get tired of. The series defies expectations by making it seem like everything is gonna go exactly like every other isekai. The protagonist will get transported to another world so that he can save that world and be loved by all. Especially women. A formula ripe for an escapist fantasy. But instead, that used rug was pulled underneath us and the protagonist in the first episode. Being the Shield Hero, now for me has the big downside of having literally zero offensive capabilities. And because of the fake rape accusations leveled against him, everyone hates him and no one wants to help him. The world is actively hostile towards him, and he doesn't already have the tools he needs to save it. And the real big hit? No hot anime GF. Now for me goes from the cusp of heaven to the depths of hell real quick. Which makes us, the audience, want to root for him. This is because the story now bears a resemblance to Rocky IV. And that's fucking tight.
Look, there's only one reasonable way to settle this. Rock, paper, scissors. Poor, predictable Bart always takes rock. Good old rock. Nothing beats that.
This all puts the Rising of the Shield Hero in a critical position. It's important that the series follows up on its narrative hook in a way that leaves the audience satisfied. One way to do that is to deliver on what is promised. For instance, if I was to watch Interspecies Reviewer's first episode, expecting it to continue in the same way, only for the rest of the series to be a generic action-adventure, I'd be pretty pissed I waited for my mom to go get groceries first. So, does the Shield Hero deliver a satisfying underdog story? No. Shield Hero takes the Shonen Jump approach of setting up an underdog and then immediately introducing a power that makes it virtually impossible for that character to be disadvantaged ever. The series very quickly reverses everything it had set up in the first episode to jump right on Naofumi's dick. The Curse Shield essentially removes any possibility of Naofumi being the underdog of this story. Remember how literally one of the defining characteristics of the Shield Hero was that he can't be offensive and thus has to rely on others? Me neither. The Curse Shield's a cheap way to give Naofumi the glory of the final attack, and the glory of being perceived as the strongest, making him more susceptible to being generic self-insert bait. Because now not only is he defensively the strongest hero, but he's also somehow offensively stronger than the heroes with strictly offensive weapons. Whether or not it succeeds in its practical objective of symbolizing Naofumi's deep-seated anger does not excuse it from this problem. And they couldn't even commit to it being a last resort with consequences, since in the second half of the series, it's literally the only way they get anything done. The idea of a hero only having defensive powers is actually a really interesting idea. I was excited to see how they'd execute on it, but it's kind of been a theme with this series to set things up that could be interesting, only to let me down every time. Instead, it just brings the Shield Hero closer to the thing it seemed it wasn't. Instead of him needing to rely on others, others have to rely on him. And for what it's worth, I also wish they added a male character to the party. So it didn't just seem like the point of the series was to blatantly self-insert into a harem consisting of children that have unhealthily imprinted on you. But it would be weird if they did that, because this is just another isekai harem series. After the introduction, the series refuses to stop making Naofumi out to be the greatest. He's the best and the coolest and everyone should love him. And hey, that's not inherently a bad thing. Everything has its place. The issue is Shield Hero given the impression it was different, only for it not to be at all. I don't love ReZero, but I can respect the series for following through on being a different type of isekai story. Unlike Shield Hero. Rising of the Shield Hero checks all the boxes. An overpowered protagonist, everyone loves him, a harem. In terms of narrative, I can't see how Shield Hero is any different than the very thing I and others hoped it wasn't. And that just isn't a good look. This all being said, Shield Hero's biggest attraction wasn't even the underdog aspect. It was the other bitch in the room. For all extensive purposes, the main antagonist for the majority of the first season is not the forces that are trying to destroy the world. It's mine. It's undeniable that many people, myself included, picked up the series on account of wanting to see her get what's coming to her. Much of the memes and discussions surrounding the series at the start was essentially how infuriating this character was, and how much they wanted to see her get beat. The first season is just as much about the revenge of the Shield Hero as it is about the Rising. And surprisingly, I think the series delivers on the former a lot more than it did on the latter. Mine's role is to be hated. The series does a good job of making her serve that role. She is awful and incompetent. She's hated, despised, and it's easy to take pleasure from her eventual fall from grace. Granted, the ride to that satisfying episode was pretty bumpy. But hey, at least we got there eventually. Even if I think Naofumi's rise to the top was unsatisfying, I can't say that seeing him on the top and the people who put him down where they belong doesn't put a smile on my face. I finally got that grape. Shield Hero failed to deliver Rocky 4, but it did deliver on Inglourious Bastards. So, why am I still not satisfied? To understand why, I'd like to talk about a series that I think, as far as their starts are concerned, is shockingly similar to the Rising of the Shield Hero. Vinland Saga. Now, both stories are obviously vastly different from one another, one being a fictionalized historical drama about Vikings, and the other being an isekai set in a medieval high fantasy world. In terms of setting, tone, and narrative, these shows are at odds with one another. But these series are identical when it comes to how they mean to hook their viewer. The emotions pushing you to continue are the same: empathy and hatred. Vinland Saga and Shield Hero both rely on our desire for fairness to keep us invested in their stories. Both series set their protagonist up in an unfair situation. For now, Fumi is being faced with false rape accusations, and for Thorfinn, it's the death of his father. This is paired with making the character who is responsible for their fall as hateable as possible. In Shield Hero, it's Mine, and for Vinland Saga, it's Askeladd. It's actually really interesting how similar Askeladd and Mine are if you're comparing their actions alone. And as far as their actions are concerned, you can certainly argue that Askeladd is far worse than Mine. He can be just as conniving, and what's worse, he's better at it. Although, even at the start, he's much more likable. The pathos of both series at their onset is wanting to see our protagonists get their revenge, and to take pleasure in seeing the antagonists get what they deserve. In Shield Hero, we get just that, while in Vinland Saga, Thorfinn in the end is deprived of his revenge. Vinland Saga, despite using revenge as its hook, doesn't deliver on it. And it's better for it. Why? Back in 2020, when Crunchyroll was doing the annual anime awards, I was looking over the nominees when I was put back that I saw that Askeladd was put under the category that was previously the Best Villain category. It was only for a second though, because the category had been aptly renamed Best Antagonist. The reason I would have been put back if they had kept the Best Villain classification is because in no capacity would I consider Askeladd the villain of Vinland Saga. On the other hand, I have no problem calling him its antagonist. Both terms still have a little bit of play to them, but at their most basic, the antagonist is the character in a story that opposes the protagonist, while a villain is an explicitly evil character in a story. A villain can both be an antagonist, a protagonist, or neither. Villain is much more of a moral denomination than it is a narrative one. A villain is explicitly evil, and often their actions are without any moral justification. That is not Askeladd, and I think seeing Askeladd as the villain is completely detrimental to the story Vinland Saga is trying to tell. And I feel comfortable saying that's not at all the common perception. Search up any of the many reaction channels that watch the series, and you'll find none of them happy about Askeladd's downfall. Even if that's what they thought they wanted only 20 episodes prior. It's a mark of the quality of Vinland Saga's writing. The series opens on this very pacifist message of not having any enemies and non-aggression. Only less than 2 episodes later, present us with what seemed like the quintessential enemy. A group of pirates that kill, pillage, and torture for fun, led by a hostage-taken shroom addict and a man with no honor. These have to be Thorfinn's enemies. What else can they be? And yet, by the end, not only did it make you feel for characters that you once thought irredeemable, but it also made you think negatively of Thorfinn's quest for revenge. They were not what they seemed. Thorfinn truly had no enemies. How did the series do this? Humanizing them and making them likable is part of this, but the real reason is by exposing Vinland Saga's real villain. Vinland Saga is explicitly a story about rejecting violence. That much is clear even from its beginning, and it is in my opinion one of the best renditions of this idea, which in itself is impressive, because it's really hard to make this kind of story work without people absolutely hating it. But what makes Vinland Saga really interesting is it doesn't just stop on getting on top of its soapbox and wagging its finger at you. Instead, it points its spotlight on the real issue: human nature. Revenge and other acts of violence much like it are much more a result of short-sighted emotion than it is rational thought. A theory as to why the impulse for revenge may have been so ingrained in some mammals is as a way of maintaining order through tick for tat. If there's a group of animals that are vengeful, then participants in that group will be wary of wronging others, because they themselves are aware that they will be the target of revenge later on. So there's always this warning: if you harm another, be prepared to be harmed equally or worse back.
I want to get Capone. I don't know how to get him.
Want to get Capone? Here's how you get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago way.
And thus peace can be maintained, but only if nothing happens. If a member of that group does decide to commit an act of violence, then it will be mutually assured destruction. The so-called chain of violence that so many series, from the juvenile to the edgy, and everything in between, loves to harp on. Vinland Saga itself even references this theory later on in the manga. The issue is, life and even cultures evolve over time based on survival and reproduction, not necessarily happiness or optimal living. Vinland Saga examines human nature through the lens of religion and folklore. The Vikings are strong and violent because Norse myth and culture idealize violence and death on the battlefield, and thus they can enjoy the spoils of war. But to be victorious one day is to accept that you'll be the loser on another. The English and the Welsh can survive in harsh conditions and under persecution because they believe that as long as they are good, they will be rewarded in the end by a higher power. But because of this, they are passive and the victims of violence. This is both true to the story of Vinland Saga and true about the real world. After all, the main target of Viking pillaging historically have been monasteries, because why would the house of an all-knowing and all-powerful god need any defenses? Persecution was not something to fight. Rather, it's the price of admission to eternal salvation. In the end, the violent and the passive may survive because of their attitudes, but no one would call the lives either lead an ideal one. In the end, they are victims of their own complacency. Askeladd knows this. He knows how it feels to be on both sides. He knows how it feels to exist under horrible circumstances, hoping to one day be saved from it. And he also knows how it feels to be strong and to take from others. He is both Welsh and a Norseman, and he hates himself for it. He hates the myths of Artorias that kept his people complacent, and in the end drove his mother mad. And he hates that he can exhibit the same aptitude for violence and coldness that led his mother and his people to ruin. It's just he doesn't know any other way to live. It's what comes the easiest, and it's always hard to go against the current of culture. This is why he was so impressed with Thor's, and was so hopeful about Canute. Both come from cultures he is familiar with and bound by. Yet despite that, they each managed to escape from it and strove for something better. Thor's is a Viking, the strongest Viking named after the strongest Norse god, and yet he avoids violence and lives as a pacifist. He tried to make something better for himself and his family in Greenland, and he had hoped one day Vinland, a land without war, a land without slavery, a paradise not built on blood, but sweat. Canute, on the other hand, despite being a Danish prince, was raised as a devout Christian. He lived his whole life passively, keeping quiet and rejecting violence just to survive. Yet, after he loses his surrogate father, he has a change of heart, and rejects the doctrines of the church. He lashes out against God for keeping salvation ever out of reach. He sees the trials of God not as a route to salvation, but instead damnation. So he decides that he must rebel against God and his faith to instead, with his own two hands, build a paradise on earth. A paradise not built on prayer, but blood if it must. Vinland Saga partly forgives the Vikings for their violence, and partly even blames the Christians for their passivity. It understands that reconciling things with violence is easy, that blindly believing that it will all work out in the end is easy. Accepting a status quo is always easier than challenging it. Askeladd saw that Thor's was different, and saw an opportunity for him to do that through nurturing Canute. By the end of Vinland Saga's prologue, chances are you're convinced of a couple things. You know that Thorfinn's quest for revenge is shallow, pointless, and ultimately helping no one, not even himself. And you know that the violence of the Vikings and the passivity of the English is to be rejected. It's why by the end we're all hoping and wishing for Askeladd's success. The series doesn't ask you to forgive Askeladd, it asks you to understand him. In the end, you did. He died both a Welshman and a Viking, pinning his hopes on something other than himself and using force to get what he wants. Askeladd was a bad person, but it's really hard to be a good person in a bad world. In the end, he hoped for something better, for Canute, for his people, for the world, and for Thorfinn.
本当の戦士になれ。トールズの子。
And it was Thorfinn in his primal and juvenile anger that was that close to ruining all the good he had given his life to do. Speaking of Thorfinn, a criticism I often see of the series is that Thorfinn is an uninteresting protagonist, that he lacked any depth or character development in the first season. And I also often hear an incorrect defense of this. People defend Thorfinn's weak characterization by saying that Thorfinn's character gets much better in the next arc, which is true, but future pros aren't justification for today's cons. If you're going to judge the first arc for what it is, you can't rely on events that happened much later. Thorfinn's character is really underdeveloped in the first season, and that's a really good thing in the context of the first season. Thorfinn's main drive is a burning desire for revenge, but Vinland Saga's whole message is that revenge ultimately nothing more than a primitive instinct. Canute for much of the first season is a coward. Years in royalty had taught him to have a very small presence if he wanted to survive. It was only once he shed that cowardice for the sake of his higher ambition, even at the possible cost of his life and primitive desires, like revenge on Askeladd, did he become a more interesting character. He grew up. It's fitting that Thorfinn's a boring character, because his ambitions, like his character, are cheap and shallow. It's only after Thorfinn is forced to drop revenge and find something else to live for that he becomes a more interesting and admirable character. So who was the real villain in the end? Whether by coincidence or by design, Vinland Saga ends up criticizing the viewer almost as much as it ends up criticizing Thorfinn. To bring this all full circle, by using a very traditional narrative hook and taking advantage of that human impulse for fairness, it puts you in Thorfinn's shoes. Allows you to empathize with his anger, only to show that allowing yourself to be moved by its narrative hook was part of the problem in the first place. The series caught you with your pants down, because if you were really better than Thorfinn, chances are you wouldn't have rooted for him in the first place. You may have even dropped the series. It shows you that you're just as human as Thorfinn, and just as human and fallible as the characters on screen. Narrative hooks aren't unique in storytelling, but rarely does a series use its hook as a way of making its message. Weirdly, Vinland Saga didn't deliver on its revenge hook in the same way that Shield Hero didn't deliver an underdog story. But it did us one better. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that Shield Hero should have gone down the same route as Vinland Saga. Shield Hero and Vinland Saga are different stories doing different things, and that's great. Shield Hero doesn't linger on the topic of mine and revenge for very long, because it's not a story about revenge. It has other things it wants to put the spotlight on. Mine was just a tool to get you to the other stuff, then be disposed of later. And I'm not saying that traditional revenge stories are necessarily bad. Revenge is still pretty badass. What I am saying is Vinland Saga is doing some pretty cool shit